I'm going to just do a little housekeeping before we get started here today. Essentially to make clear that we are not having a city council meeting. This is a policy session. And therefore, we don't have a roll call, we don't have an attorney, we don't have our council secretary. And typically we have these these policy sessions over in our small hearing room in anticipation that we may have guests, or that we would have guests today. Welcome, all of you guests. And we moved into the larger hearing room, which means that there's more space, it looks more formal, but really the hope is to have a conversation with the Citizens League and get a check-in on a process that they've had looking at the minimum wage in St. Paul as the first part of our agenda, and then the second part, a continuing conversation with the City Council about St. Paul Street project rates and our proposed policies. So we have scheduled about an hour for each, although if we're done with our business before that time, that's fine. I also want to welcome Samantha Henningsen to the table. Welcome. She is officially appointed to the City Council to replace Russ Stark as of today. Her official swearing in is at 3:30 this afternoon, but I think given your interest in both of these topics and the fact that you'll be sitting in that chair for the next 6 months, it was important to have you at the table today. So, and we also won't be making any formal votes. So, I think that's it. This also isn't really a public hearing. It's just an opportunity for us to hear from the Citizens League and then again from our Finance and Public Works staff about our street construction. So with that, are there anything else to come before us before we get started? No? Great. All right. Well, let's move to our first item, the Citizens League report on community input on minimum wage. And I believe we have a report from Pahoua and Hoffman from the Citizens League. So welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to come present the report. For the record, my name is Pahoua Hoffman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens League. The Citizens League, for those of you who don't know, is a nonpartisan public policy organization, nonpartisan nonprofit public policy organization. Community engagement and policy development are two of our core competencies. We do this in a number of ways, but mainly through the convening of stakeholder committees or task forces to study an issue and work towards recommendations for policy change. Recent work include the Met Council reform, transit finance for the state, and specific to the City of St. Paul last year, the Citizens League convened a stakeholder committee to explore the possibility of payment or services in lieu of taxes. We call that our pilot program for tax-exempt property owners. It was after the completion of this project that the Citizens League was approached by the St. Paul Foundation, who funded that work, to see if we would be interested in helping the city again, this time exploring conversations around the minimum wage. I want to leave as much room as possible for questions, and so I'm going to give a pretty high-level overview. Instead of launching a 6-month study committee, stakeholder study committee, which is our typical timeline, we made the decision to start first with a short...
Pahoua,
yeah.
Just wanted to just interject that the report, the Citizens League initial report was published yesterday? Monday. So this should be available for people online as well.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So again, instead of launching a 6-month stakeholder committee, which is a typical timeline for our work, we made the decision to start first with a short scoping project to better understand the concerns and questions from the community, including advocacy groups, the business community, community groups, employers, and workers representing different industries and sectors. By knowing the concerns and questions specific to St. Paul, the Citizens League felt it would be in a better position to recruit the needed representation to serve on a study committee, to answer these questions and hopefully make recommendations on a possible minimum wage ordinance to the city. Our work focused on surfacing questions and concerns, reviewing existing reports, and also asking about possible stakeholders who might be part of a second, longer phase. The work to collect community input started at the end of November 2017 and completed earlier this month. Over this period, I personally conducted the interviews, I attended the listening sessions, and I reviewed the emails and online submissions. Some of the groups and individuals contacted me directly. As some of you know, there was quite a bit of press around this study, and so people were made aware of it. Some were recommended to me to contact because they represented industries and sectors that employed low-wage workers in St. Paul. In the time that the Citizens League had for this scoping project, I knew I would not have enough time to meet with everyone I wanted to meet, and certainly there wasn't enough time for me to meet some of the people you may have wanted me to meet with, council members. Knowing that we may get another opportunity to get more community feedback in a possible phase 2, I focused on getting a good spread of different perspectives and a good representation of different industries and sectors. On page 12 of the report, if you have that in front of you, I explain how I framed the discussion. By design, I asked open-ended questions as not to limit where an individual or a group might take the conversation. Most meetings were 1 to 2 hours long. While the names of the participants on page 31 to 32 may only show up once here in the report, I often met with or communicated with individuals or groups more than once. It is a Citizens League belief that what gets said is more important than who says it. To get candid and honest feedback, we did not attribute any comment to any one person. This is unique. This is not unique to this project. Many participants, in fact, expressed appreciation for this Citizens League practice, which allowed them to speak freely without any retaliation. In putting together the report of the various sections, based on my notes and the submissions through email or online, I did share drafts with individuals or groups that represented a particular perspective or who helped me inform that section. So every section was reviewed by them for accuracy before the report was made public. This required obviously more time to prepare the report, but the result, I believe, is a report that everyone should have some confidence in. At this time, I'm happy to go through the sections of the report, if you wish. Okay, thank you, Council President. The report begins first with an overview of St. Paul. On pages 4, staff in my office put together that information of employment, St. Paul resident industry data, and the cost of living data using existing information on the DEED website. You can see down at the bottom of page 4, we were able to calculate using the DEED cost of living tool. Unfortunately, the data cannot be drilled down to a city level, but as St. Paul is the largest city in Ramsey County, you can see here that an average hourly wage to meet the cost of living for Ramsey County, we show here using the tool as $19.48.
Ms. Hoffman, I
Yes.
also just want to underscore that I think that is, I was appreciative when I read through this initially that you use that as the data point for a perspective for people who may not be as familiar with the demographics of Ramsey County. St. Paul is 56% of Ramsey County, so we're the biggest city by a lot. In fact, each of our wards is larger than the next biggest city in Ramsey County. So I think it's our data. So I thank you for using that.
Thank you, Council President. On pages 5 through 11, we were able to engage a PhD student at the University of Minnesota School of Applied Economics. In our office, like I said earlier, our core competency is community engagement and convening. Our core competency is not technical research, and so we were able to get the help of Mr. Thomas Durfee at the University of Minnesota to provide more technical data on pages 5 through 11. And one of the things that I mentioned to Mr. Durfee that helped him frame what I wanted to see and what I wanted to include in this report was how many people live in the St. Paul but might commute to work elsewhere. And alternatively, how many people live outside of St. Paul who are commuting to work in the city of St. Paul. And so you can see this data reflected in his memo. Some of the things I want to highlight is on page 6, that under St. Paul residents on page 6, you see that the largest share of St. Paul residents actually do work in St. Paul as well. About 40,000 St. Paul residents work in St. Paul, and that the typical low-wage worker is just as likely to be young as middle and older. So there is no distinction between ages where there might be in other cities where low-wage workers might be younger or older. There isn't even spread here in the city of St. Paul. On page 8, just want to talk a little bit about the income of residents living in St. Paul in section 4.3. We define, or Thomas defined, Mr. Durfee defined low-income residents as those earning less than $1,250 a month. An hourly breakdown later in that same paragraph is $7.10 an hour if you assume a 22-day workday in the month. So you could see how this spreads out in the top 5 cities of St. Paul, Minneapolis, Bloomington, and Roseville and Maplewood. So I just want to provide that context. The community input, where I spent most of my time collecting information, begins on page 12. And how these industries and sectors came to be were really through reports that we had read and organized groups who had let us know what were some of the major tension points, whether they be restaurant servers who represented a particular point of view for tip credit, or restaurant servers who had a point of view against tip credits. We also knew that there were challenges within various sectors where there were set limitations as far as reimbursement rates, and so we wanted to better understand what those were. And so many of the industries and sectors here represented communities that we were aware of, but we wanted to find more information. At this time, I'm happy to take questions, or I can go through each of the various sections.
I think it's helpful to just keep rolling through. Are there particular? I'm noting that there are copies of the report on the table over there. If there are people who, I mentioned that it was online, but there are also some hard copies if people want to follow.
Okay. So then what I will do then is I will cover the highlights for each section. So on page 12 begins the beginning of the community input. And I just organize these by alphabetical order. So there's no particular reason other than that to put them in the order that I did. The first group that is represented in the report are nonprofits in the day training and employment service of people with disabilities. So these are nonprofits that are providing job employment training for mainly adults with disabilities, or they are providing actual work for adults with disabilities. And currently they are allowed to provide these services for rates that might be below or at minimum wage. And the federal law allows them to do this. This is also what makes the employees that they're training to have jobs and be able to take jobs, because they are paid a lesser wage. They're more competitive, meaning there are adults with disabilities that might take longer to perform an activity or a duty. Chances are businesses may not afford these individuals an opportunity to work if they are mainly concerned about high levels of productivity. But because these individuals can be employed at a lower rate, they are more desirable to companies who might be willing to take a chance to provide these individuals an opportunity. And so these groups are concerned that if the minimum wage were to increase, they may not be able to provide these individuals the opportunities that they are looking for and would like. And so they have the limitations of state reimbursement rates and also staff requirements. So they are reimbursed at specific rates, and if the minimum wage were to increase and this set reimbursement rate doesn't increase alongside with it, they are nervous that adults with disabilities may not get these opportunities moving forward.
So just so I understand, the organizations that you talk to that provide this service for people with primarily adults with disabilities are reimbursed by the county or the state for that service, and then in addition, so they cover their costs by a state or federal or county payment, and then the wage that is charged to the employer goes to the client?
Correct. That's correct, Council President. So their key question, one of their key questions is, how would nonprofit providers continue to provide the needed employment and job training to services with people with disabilities if the state reimbursement rate does not also increase? Moving on to franchisees, locally owned micro and small businesses. In general, we heard from small businesses that they feel over the course of the last 5 years, they've had to absorb many changes already. And so what I've laid out on page 14 are some of those changes. So for them, for those who employ 50 or more, it began with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, where some of the employers who have 50 or more employees were mandated to provide health insurance, and many did, who are of that size. In that same year of 2014, the Minnesota legislature increased the state minimum wage, and you can see the phase-in process for that in 2014, 2015, and 2016, and increased from, for large employers, from $8 to $9 to $9.50 by August 1st of 2016. As we all know, in January of this year, the state minimum wage increased again, $9.65 for large employers and $7.87 for small employers. And also around the same time, Earn Sick and Save Time came into effect. In addition to this, some business owners informed me that they also saw increases in their property taxes. This is on top of city expenses, related expenses such as city code compliance. So many small businesses felt like over the last 4 or 5 years, they've had to accommodate for these changes. That to them, as small business owners, 4 years may seem like a long time to some, but for them, it was just yesterday. And so they felt that they have had to absorb and have had to accommodate these changes, and they were very disappointed to hear that the city of St. Paul may be considering a minimum wage increase at a city level. So they saw changes at the federal level, they saw changes at the state level, they saw changes at the city level with earned sick and safe time, and now another city level possible ordinance around minimum wage increase. So here I begin with franchisees. I talked to franchise owners of 2 large and well-known franchises here in the city of St. Paul. What they really wanted the city council and the mayor and the public to know is that while they are affiliated with a large and known brand, many of their prices of their products and goods are set at the national level. So unlike smaller, locally owned businesses, they cannot simply increase the prices of their products to accommodate for any increases in labor costs. And so this was one of their main concerns. And that the only thing they could do to accommodate for any increases would be to decrease the number of staff or hours. I met with a number of locally owned small businesses, and I highlight several here in the report. Certainly there are things that I knew going in, and there were some surprises. And for me, one of the surprising stories is local bookstores. Everyone wants a small, independent local bookstore in their neighborhood, in their city. But bookstores, like franchisees, their prices are set. So in the case of bookstores, their prices are set by the publisher. So as you all know, you look at the book jacket, that price that's there is the price that that bookseller must sell it at. And so he or she who owns a bookstore cannot increase the prices. And so this was one of their limitations. They did not feel, because they can't increase the prices of their products, they have to either, again, reduce staff or reduce hours to accommodate for that change. And many of them have already, many of them communicated the fact that they were already working on very thin margins, as it is being a bookseller. We also had small businesses who are more in the industrial space. Met with a gentleman who owns a small company, 35 employees. He works in the industrial part of St. Paul. He currently, right now, of his 35 employees, he employs many individuals who are coming out of corrections or coming out of recovery. And he provides them a place, he believes, where people can begin to rebuild their work history and their life. And he believes that if the minimum wage were to increase to $15, the public good that he believes he's providing, he would have to really examine that if there's an increase in labor costs for him. That he might be forced to hire individuals with a more solid work history who may be able to come in prepared for the jobs that he has rather than take the time to train. So this was a concern of his.
Ms. Hoffman, was he also acknowledging that the competitiveness of the current workforce, and that might, while it might be true in theory, there's a shortage of workers, and so I mean, did he acknowledge that he might want to be more picky with his employment, but he might not have that option?
Council President, we did talk about that. What I would say, and what he might say if he were here, is that the jobs that he has and the positions that he has open may not be the most desirable. They are highly physical work, heavy work, and so it's true the market could determine the price for him, but I think he's also cognizant of the fact that the positions he has, people might come in, but might quickly leave to find better positions too.
Right. Ms. Prince.
And just to follow up on Council President Brenmoen's point, Ms. Hoffman, in the labor shortage that we are moving into might have informed all of these discussions. I mean, was there any recognition that that paying a more competitive wage is part of what they're needing to do anyway to get workers. And I would say that across the sectors. So if you want to touch on it going forward.
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Prince, certainly that came up in many conversations. Certainly in the manufacturing section that I'll be talking about soon, that they're already seeing that workforce shortage. They're experiencing it now. And even with, and they feel they're providing competitive wages now, and still they're not seeing the number of people applying as they hope.
Right.
We also were able to engage with some immigrant-owned businesses. I will say that, one of my recommendations for further study in the back of my report is that there needs to be more work done here. In the 2 months or so that I had, this is not enough time to build the trust and credibility with immigrant-owned businesses and communities that are not used to this kind of process. So it needs more time, it needs more care, it needs more cultivation to make sure that they are comfortable engaging with even someone like me who may look like them to be part of a process like this. And so we were able to luckily work with trusted community partners who are familiar with certain groups, and they were able to go and in some cases meet on our behalf and bring them forward so that they could talk to me about their questions and concerns. And many of the people who we met with who are immigrant-owned businesses are just not even clear about a minimum wage increase, what this means, this might mean to them, how they might accommodate it, what a phase-in period is, what are exemptions. And so there needs to be a lot more education for certain groups. And so I just want to note that.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. I know we checked in several times as you've gone through the scoping project about trying to engage with our newest Americans. And so I know that you have done the outreach, and I also appreciate kind of the context for that. We know sometimes second and third generation immigrant communities are much more established and can have those conversations in a way that people who are, here for 4 years needed to have it framed differently. So I appreciate the extra effort that you've made, and think that we all want to continue to partner with you as we move forward to make sure that those voices are heard, and it sounds like it's a priority for you. Ms. Naker.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Hoffman, I would echo that and just say I think it's really important that our immigrant business owners be part of the conversation, since they're some of our most robust job creators. And I guess I'm wondering, from your point about needing additional education for them to be fully engaged in the process, obviously that's a long-term, probably generational strategy that we need to think more about at the council level. But do you anticipate that you'll be able to do some more robust engagement with immigrant communities during the study committee process that's about to take place?
Councilmember Brenmo and Councilmember Necker, I do believe we can. One of the things that I didn't get a chance to do in this short phase, but I would like to be able to do in a second phase, is bring in translators who speak the language of the communities we want to engage with. As you can see, most of the interviews and even the online submissions were all done in English. And so we have many small businesses here in St. Paul that are owned and operated by members of that community. So they are serving, if they're a Karen business owner, they are mainly serving, in some instances, their Karen community. And so being able to find individuals who can act as translators, interpreters, to make sure that they fully understand what might happen, and to fully get from them their input on their questions and concerns. And I do think that that's possible. Those resources do exist. I think it was hard in this short time to engage them and then find the time to roll that out. So many of the small business key questions, and there are many, on pages 15, they have a lot to do with just having the needed administrative support to understand new rules in order to comply with them was a concern. There are many micro businesses. Consider Hmong Village where there are stalls. They were very curious and concerned about how the city might define small businesses. Some of the individuals we spoke to understood how they are defined in the city of Minneapolis, and they wanted to know whether there would be openness in defining small businesses differently here in St. Paul, especially those micro businesses where there are 9 employees or fewer. And that in the city of Minneapolis, they define small business as 100 employees or fewer. And for many, they just thought that was such a large spread that 5 employees and 99 employees, that was a considerable jump. And they were looking for some more segmentation. And lastly, there are some small businesses that were nervous about what the increase in the minimum wage might affect families who are on public assistance. And you'll see this theme come up again in the section on low-wage workers. On page 16 is the section on home health care, nursing homes, and senior housing. There is an increase of small home health care businesses here in St. Paul, and many of them are actually owned by immigrants. Their limitation is that currently they are getting the services that they provide in part are covered by Medicaid reimbursement. So I actually list a specific reimbursement rate here in the report. It's $17.40. They're concerned that if the minimum wage were to increase to $15, this would not give them enough room to operate. And for the health home care businesses, they describe the positions as very challenging, both mentally, emotionally, and physically challenging work. That this is work that likely, unless you feel it's your calling, it's work that you might not want to do but have to do. And so would they like to see an increase in the minimum wage? They would tell you yes, because they believe that if the minimum wage were to increase, if this were considered a high-wage business model, they would actually see more client satisfaction, because the care that that client would be receiving would be from someone who was well paid, there were few turnovers. They do want to see that. Unfortunately, as they said, their Medicaid reimbursement rate is limited right now at $17.40. So it's not, they want me to make sure that you all understood that they are for a minimum wage increase. It would actually help their business. It would help create a culture in this sector that these are honorable jobs and that they would be held in high regard. And so anything that would contribute to that, they would embrace. Again, the limitation is the reimbursement rate.
And pardon me for not knowing this, but so that rate is set by the federal government. Is it vary from region to region or city to city, or is it a flat rate across the country?
I'll have to check on that, Council President Brenmoen. I believe this is set by federal and state. I'll have to check on that.
Okay.
But I believe that that rate is pretty uniform across the country.
Okay, Ms.
I'll
Nader.
check.
And just as a follow-up to that, I'm curious as to whether that rate is on a schedule of increases, perhaps with cost of living or consumer price index. Just, I know that a lot of folks you talk to assumed that we were talking about $15 an hour tomorrow, and we specifically did not put a number in this report and asked to look at raising the wage to some number. What would that number be, and how long would we be talking about, and how would it be phased in? And so I think part of the question I have is, if 1740 doesn't cover 15, does 1740 increase incrementally over time? Is it scheduled to?
Councilmember Necker, it sounded to me in my interviews with them that this is not a regular increase that they have seen at the Medicaid reimbursement rate. In fact, when I asked the specific question of, do they think it's likely that this Medicaid reimbursement rate would increase anytime soon? They did not think that it was going to. That it was going to take a considerable amount of lifting to do that. And one of the, I would characterize it as relief, is should an ordinance be considered here in the city of St. Paul, they would ask for a long phase-in time in order to have that time to work towards a higher Medicaid reimbursement rate. So the home health care business, that is their main pain point, is the reimbursement rate. Like I said, they would want me to tell you that it is in their best interest to see wages go up in this industry, in this sector. I would say that the same applies for nursing home and senior housing. They too are limited by the reimbursement rate set by federal and state. I would say nursing homes and senior housing have the additional limitation that they must have a client to staff ratio. So they need to keep at all times, nursing homes, mainly nursing homes, but also senior housing, professional staff on hand to meet regulations. So unlike other businesses, they cannot reduce staff or reduce staff hours in order to accommodate an increase in labor costs. Moving on to large employers. Maybe the large employers that we spoke to, and I define large employers here in this report as 500 employees or more. St. Paul is lucky to have all these large employers here. Generally speaking, many of them are paying at or above 15. What they are, there's some minor, I would say minor concerns that as they bring on new employees to a 15, if it was introduced, it would just mean that they would have to examine the individuals who are supervising the $15. That might push some pressure on supervisor roles for those that they might have to increase rates as they go up. But they wanted me to note that that was a minor HR concern, that this wasn't a major concern to them. What they were mainly concerned about, large employers, was the stress and the on small and mid-sized businesses. That as a business community at large, given the mandates and requirements on small and mid-sized businesses, some of which I explained earlier, health insurance, earn sick and save time, increases in the minimum wage, that they were just concerned this might create a climate in St. Paul that might be considered not business friendly. And so they just wanted to make sure that that was taken into consideration.
Ms. Henningsen.
I was just wondering for the large employees or employers, whether the $15 an hour currently being paid includes like contract employees, like custodial or security staff, or if we could confirm that.
Council President Brennan and Councilmember Henningsen, it would be one area they said they would have to look at. So many of them, securing, for example, they contract with Sodexo to do their food service. And so it is one thing that they noted that they would have to check. Because how they answered this question was mainly due to their direct employees, hourly employees. And this comes up again when we talk about private institutions, that they are also aware of contract employees who may or may not be working at those levels.
Right, I was having this kind of a similar question when you were talking about Hmong Village or other places where there's booths. and whether each of the booths is its own small business, or if the employer or the owner of the whole facility is the employer, and those things that we have to navigate. So I think will be an interesting definition. Ms. Prince.
Yeah, and I wondered with the large employers, for example, Wells Fargo recently announced that they're raising the minimum wage. Did they explain why they were at 15?
Council President Brenmoen, Councilmember Prince, they explained that the move to 15 had, in large part, having to do with new tax form policies. So this is what prompted. It might have been something they were wanting to do, but this prompted them to do it now. So I believe both in the case of U.S. Bank and also Wells Fargo, they'll be moving all hourly wage employees to 15 by March, I believe.
Ms. Naker.
I noticed that you mentioned here the wage compression issue, and this is something that I've heard about from a lot of constituents I've talked to, where the minimum wage might go up, and then other employees making more are expected to make more too. And I noticed that it's not called out as a specific question for follow-up. I don't think elsewhere in the report. Was that intentional, or is that something that will be looked into in the second phase?
Councilmember President Bremo and Councilmember Necker, that is called out in some questions. In places I'm trying to remember where it comes up, but this idea of if we increase the wages for the lowest workers, what might one need to do in that company to right-size employees who might be either supervising them or who have either been there longer? And I believe this comes up again in the youth wage worker section.
Thank you.
They didn't. The large employers did not have a specific question to this point because they felt like they could handle this internally. It's just an HR issue and a timing issue for them. On that same page, on page 19, low-wage worker advocates, we met with a number of advocacy community organization, labor unions, who are doing a lot of work supporting low-wage workers, wanting to see many of our lowest wage workers succeed, wanting to make sure that those who may not have a voice through them. And so I start this section by highlighting a recent study done by the Met Council on Poverty. And you can see that towards the end of that first paragraph, the cities with the highest share of residents in poverty were St. Paul at 40.8%. And this is one of the highest. It's followed by Brooklyn Center at 39.5, Columbia Heights at 39.1, and Minneapolis at 37.9. While I met with many individuals, groups, advocacy groups, labor unions, the one story that I think really paints a picture of the real lived experiences that these groups are wanting to support is this one that I highlight here. We met with the worker-led organization Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en Lucha. Sorry, my Spanish is rusty. It's known as CTUL. And in this particular interview, the representative from CTUL introduced me to a woman who works at who's a low-wage worker. She works in the cleaning services industry. She is a contract worker. She is being contracted by a cleaning service to clean for a large retailer here in St. Paul. She has worked in this company for 14 years. When she started working, she worked for $7.25. In her 14 years, she's only seen very few increases. She currently makes $10.75 now. She works 5 hours a day, 7 days a week. She does not get any benefits, and she gets no opportunities for overtime. She actually quite likes her job. She talks about it with some affection. She also likes it because she can walk to work. She would want me to let you know that if not for a mandate, she may never get to 15. For the company that she works for, who is a contract service, it is in their best interest to hire workers at the lowest wage possible. This keeps that contract service competitive. It's what gets them the bid to provide the cleaning services to large retailers or large businesses. She works with a few other people. They work fewer hours than she does. It's because of her long tenure that she gets to work 5 hours a day now. She would like more hours, but she cannot get them. And so through an interpreter, I learned about her story. I also learned about what she wishes for herself and for her children. And she spoke pretty firmly and confidently that there be no exemptions for anyone, including youth workers. That she believes everyone should have the opportunity to make at least 15, and that even youth workers who may be supporting their families may need to be at that same level, even knowing that she's been working there for 14 years.
Ms. Hoffman, also just not to freak you out, but we have about 20 minutes left, so just, okay. Just so you have a
I've gotten so comfortable here. I'm so sorry.
That's why I didn't want to freak you out.
Okay,
Kind of in
all
a
right.
flow, but just to let you know, we have about 20.
Okay, I'll move quickly. The manufacturing area here, I'll just move quickly and say that.
Oh, one moment, Ms. Prince.
And before you speed up, one thing that strikes me in this section is the point that is made on behalf of low-wage workers that with our transit problems and our lack of affordable housing, that the minimum wage is just one of the challenges that they're confronting. I just wondered if you could say a little more about that.
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Prince, thank you for reminding me of that point. This is a point that I've heard not just in the case of this example, but in many of the listening sessions. In fact, I had the opportunity to meet with some gentlemen at Ujamaa Place who mentioned that an increase in the minimum wage is just one piece that they're looking for. That they know and they realize that an increase in the minimum wage does something, but not everything. They want to see a more comprehensive and holistic approach to lifting people out of poverty. They see this as looking at affordable housing. They see this as creating and developing a better transit system that works for them. Childcare was mentioned quite a bit. And again, I just want to mention that, we do have a question about what if a low-wage worker were to make 15 or have an increase in their wages? What might this do to individuals who are on public assistance? Would they make enough to let go of that safety net? Or if they made too much to qualify, could they make it without that needed public assistance? Some were naturally worried about that and were concerned about that. Others were they actually took offense to that question. That, and I think I quote it here, don't dangle that safety net over our heads. We're trying to get ourselves out of here. And it sounded to them, they interpreted that question as wanting to keep them there. And so I think what the question they would ask back is, is that the right question to ask?
Well, and I think it's partially, I mean, it's no reason to not move forward, but it is, as we're having these conversations, I think what I'm recognizing is we're opening up opportunities to have other conversations about the way programs are administered. And I mean, this is just an opportunity to also do things better outside of even just increasing the wage. And, you know, questions, to me, there's no reason why if you get a promotion, you should suddenly stop getting all benefits. Like, is there a way to get a reduced amount of benefits? Or is there a way to, like, have a timed phase out of benefits instead of just, like, it's done? And those are conversations, I think, as we move forward, we need to engage with our state legislature and our county representatives to make sure that we all recognize we're a very connected part of people's lives. And one thing that happens at the city will have impacts at the county and the state and federal. And so I don't think, to me, it's not a reason to not continue. It's just something that we have to tackle at the same time. Mr. Tao.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add on that, in that our job is that when there is no safety net, we end up having to mitigate that and solve that. And so I think these questions are very fair. During your interview, were you able to talk with any low-wage worker that was still dependent on other safety net services? And also, did you get a chance to interview with anyone from Ramsey County?
Councilmember President Brenmo and Councilmember Tao, to your second question first, I did not interview anybody from Ramsey County in this phase, but it's something that I would like to do in the second phase. To your first question of whether or not I was able to interview anybody who is currently on public assistance, is that correct? And who might be worried about minimum wage increase? There were certainly workers, personal care attendant workers, who are currently on some kind of public assistance were concerned. Some of the public care attendant workers who are working in immigrant-owned home health care businesses are concerned that they're currently not making enough now they are complementing the pay that they're getting in their position with some public assistance. And even with the increase, they would not be able to let that go. All right, so with the time that I had, the manufacturing, I just want to note that this is an industry and an area where employers are desperately seeking workers and are not finding enough workers to fill the positions that they have. They feel that they're trying very hard to change the perception of manufacturing positions, that this is an industry where they are willing to train workers who want to lift themselves out of poverty, that they have many opportunities for upward mobility. And right now they're finding it very challenging to find those workers. They ask that it not be just a standalone minimum wage increase, but that it be a collaborative effort to help support them in finding these workers, because they have already their own challenges in finding their workers. Even paying more, they're not seeing some of the workers that they'd like to see. I'll spend most of my time on the restaurants. I think this is probably one of the better documented disagreements and challenges. Restaurant workers mainly sit on two sides. We have restaurant workers and owners who are asking for one wage, no tip credit or tip penalty. They believe in one wage for all workers, and they believe that this would create a more equitable workplace between front of house in the dining room and the back of house in the kitchen. By contrast, the restaurant and hospitality workers on the other side who are looking for a tip credit, many servers, we heard mostly from servers rather than owners. We did hear from some owners, but the servers who are asking for a tip credit, Many of them say they're already making well above the 15. Some are making upwards of $40, $50 an hour currently with tips. I will say it was truly compelling to hear many people in a listening session demand that they not get a raise. They believe that due to the thin margins of the business, their owners may not have the funds or be able to increase prices enough to accommodate wages for the back of house if they too see an increase. And so they'd rather that increase be transferred to the backup, to the kitchen, to the back of house. I'm probably not giving enough time to this, these two perspectives right now, given the time that I have here today, but I think that what I have in the report accurately reflects their points of view and their perspective.
Ms. Hoffman. Ms. Prince has a question.
Ms. Hoffman, just to point out, Minnesota is one of the few states that, in its current minimum wage policy, does not have a tip credit. Is that right? I mean, the minimum wage is paid to servers across the board right now.
Council President Bradmo and Councilmember Prince, you are correct. Minnesota is one of 7 states that have one minimum wage for everyone, and that there is no sub-minimum wage. So, for example, in other states, there is a sub-minimum wage of, for example, as low as $2.13 for workers who are getting tips. And then there is the regular minimum wage for those who are not getting tips. And so in Minnesota, there is one minimum wage. And so advocates for a one wage would say there isn't a two-tiered system now. So why would the city create one with an increase in a minimum wage without bringing everybody along?
And I think it's fair to state we see you. Sometimes it's when we're having these conversations, I want to acknowledge that we understand that the room is full of people who are here in support of 15 now. And also it looks like predominantly people are here in support of including tip or not including the tip in your wage. If you are here on that specific issue on 15, can you just raise your hand so we can take a look? One thing, I mean, I realize 15, of course, but if you're here on the tip question, if you could just raise your hand. I see a lot of people have that. Okay. And I think it's also important to point out that, and just in the short time that we've been having these conversations, this issue also seems to have the most organized advocates on both sides. And so I think that there are pieces of this that are talking about groups of folks that don't have an organized base behind them and will never have an organized base behind them. So I'm glad that we're giving time for all of these issues in addition to this. So just, I appreciate that we're giving a thoughtful time to folks that I'm thinking about, like the Medicaid reimbursement and the people who are in home health care that will never be at the council advocating in this manner. So we do appreciate, we see you and recognize that the groups are very organized and appreciate the input that we've heard so far.
So lastly, we have youth training wage. They're advocates for a youth training wage. They believe they're providing young, inexperienced individuals their first experience working. There are what they call traditional work time, where a young person may be working at a bakery, maybe selling product, but a lot of times they are being trained. So it's more of a classroom time. And in order for them to train the number of young people now, they would like to see a youth training wage for them so that they continue to provide as this needed service for as many young people as possible. That if the wage were to move to 15, they would only be able to provide services for some. And for some programs, this would call into question the mission of the organization completely if they weren't able to serve the numbers of young people that they would like to serve. Again, I'm probably not giving justice here in the time that I have, but the youth training wage supporters really helped me flesh out this section, and so it does really accurately reflect their perspective. By contrast, there were those who oppose a youth training wage, and that there are many young people who are heads of households who might be needing these kinds of employment and training opportunities, but may not seek them out if the wages are lower than what they can get elsewhere. And so they call to question the true mission and intent of young training programs. And if that we're truly trying to serve the people most in need, let's not make this, let's not create a lower wage so that they actually seek out these services. I will stop there.
Ms. Naker.
Well, I know we're going to have a lot more conversation about this, but I just wanted to thank you right now for the thoughtfulness and the breadth of this report and the work that you've done to get to this point. And I'm just so glad that we're being so thoughtful about such an important and complicated policy change, and I'm thrilled that the Citizens League is involved in it because your work is just exemplary. And I also just want to thank, to sort of echo Council President Brenmoen's point, everybody for being here today. I'm sure that we're all going to get to know each other a lot better over the next few months and see a lot of each other. And I'm glad that you're here now because I think it is really important that everybody, no matter what particular angle of this problem you're concerned with, is here to hear about all of the other angles that we as policymakers are going to have to be wrangling with. And so hopefully this doesn't become a conversation that's focused just on one particular issue, and if we don't get that issue, that we got nothing, but really have a nuanced conversation about this. I know that's why it was so important to us as a council to start with this data and this thoughtful conversation. I think that's how we get the best policy in the end. So I'm looking forward to the engagement to come. And I guess just on a final note, I wanted to say, these issues all are born out of a lot of enthusiasm and passion and values, and we didn't really talk about values very much today because we have to dig into the details when we're making policy, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this is ultimately about our values as a city, and not whether or not we should have a minimum wage, because we have a minimum wage, but what should that minimum wage reflect? Why did we set one in the first place, and what should it be, and what should the outcomes of having one be for people? And I think it's important to note, as this report does, that the minimum wage in the 60s and 70s kept a full-time worker at or a little bit above the poverty level. And now it keeps people at about 30% of the poverty level, not to mention what would actually cost to have a living wage in the city of St. Paul. So I think I'm going to be keeping those values first and foremost as we work through all the details to come.
Great. Mr. Tao.
Ms. Hoffman, thank you for you and your team. I read through this and I thought that it was a really fair assessment. And I know that you'll continue to work with the immigrant community so that we have a full analysis of their challenges and their aspiration. I think that as we move forward, it's important that we have the right data and that it's policy is sort of a science and art mixed together. And this is definitely one of those. I know that everyone in this room want people to pay well, but we should make our decision based on the kind of impact that it will have on all of our business and all of our residents and the kind of unintended outcome that we might have. And so I look forward to having those discussions and keep up the good work.
Ms. Prince.
And obviously, to echo my colleagues, this is extremely helpful and a really good start on this conversation. What I want to speak to for those of you who are gathered here, and I so appreciate that you are here and that I'm hearing from so many about this issue, is that one really striking statistic in this report is that St. Paul has the highest poverty rate in the metro area, that we've added 6 census districts between 2011 and 2015. And that information is absolutely chilling to me, although I can clearly see it in the areas that I represent. And I think one thing we need to understand as a community is that in addition to the minimum wage, the city, one of the city's core missions is the development of housing. And one of the areas that we've really fallen down in, through no one's fault, I mean, I think it is a funding issue, is that low-wage worker housing is that housing that's at 30% of area median income. And we're developing very little of that in St. Paul. And we really need to get there, and we need to figure out how we're going to do that, because the city's own statistic that it arrived at in 2015 is that we have, 16,000 cost-burdened households in St. Paul when it comes to housing. Cost-burdened means 16,000 households that are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. So at the same time that we're doing this, all of us, everyone in this room, needs to be really pushing the housing agenda at the same time. We have got to address the extremely low vacancy rate we have that is making landlords, and I hate to say it, but on my side of town, some really lousy landlords, the big winners in this economy. So I just want to be clear that as a city, raising the minimum wage is vital, but we definitely need to be creating affordable housing at the same time.
Ms. Henningsen.
Just in the interest of time, not to do your job, but can you talk about next steps, please?
Councilmember President Ramon and Councilmember Henningsen, I know that this report just came to you on Monday. So it is the citizens' hope that after you've had a chance to fully explore it, digest it, that we can come back together to come up with a new scope of work for a phase 2, if there is a wish for a phase 2. From what I've heard, there is an interest in exploring what that might look like. We could move forward at the Citizens League pretty quickly once we determine what that scope of work would include. I would need to go back to our funder, in this case it's St. Paul Foundation, and go back to my board with that scope of work to get it approved so that we can move forward. Citizens League being small comes with its benefits, and one of that is being able to be nimble and act quickly. And so we could begin a second phase as early as next month if we can come together and agree on a scope of work.
Great. And I just, I was sort of writing down what I think next steps are as well. I appreciate your recommendations for possible phase 2, but I think, initially when you were working with the St. Paul Foundation and when we had conversations about what this could look like with your predecessor, the idea was to have a scoping project, meet the stakeholders, and the stakeholders would tell us what other stakeholders we should be meeting with, to be sure we knew which questions we needed to be asking. And I know sometimes our neighboring city, Minneapolis, takes progressive action sometimes a few months before we do, and the advocates go through all the work in Minneapolis, and they come to St. Paul, and they're like, we're ready. And we do need to pause and take the time to ask those questions and understand it in the context of St. Paul. So I think it's really important that we're doing this, and I appreciate people's patience while we make sure that we're asking these questions, and then beyond asking them, being able to get the answers to them. But I also think that in doing the work that you've done so well to this point, it does make the case to the foundation for funding to move forward with phase 2. So, and that ensures that we keep taking steps. Our plan, just so people are clear, is to have an ordinance in front of us by fall. And so I think we're on a pretty fast track from the time we got this started till the time that we will see a fourth reading of an ordinance. So I think we're definitely on the right path, and I think that you've set the stage for how we move into a phase 2 with a funding source, or with a funding foundation, and also with the council on board. So I appreciate this. I think we'll continue to have conversations with you. And I think, echoing many of my colleagues, I really thank the community members and the advocates for being here today and in the weeks and months leading up to this. And I really encourage you to stay engaged as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Council President Brenmo and council members, thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Just raise it. It's good though, right? It's good for them to hear.
I'm just going to give them a second.
No, it's like, I wish we could have that
You-
level
you-
of, not on all issues, but.
Yeah, I just
We
was
need a
like,
granola bar at 11. That's just the thing. Diet Dr. Pepper at 2 and a granola bar at 11.
I just was thinking, there was, since we weren't going to vote on anything, it was like, if we gave her another half hour, it would just be,
That was good.
I should have said something sooner. All right, let's move on to our second agenda item, the St. Paul Streets project rates and proposed policy. I have Kathy Lantry and Todd Hurley on the agenda, but I think Todd is presenting. Welcome.
Good morning, Council President Brenmo, members of the City Council, Todd Hurley, Office of Financial Services. I won't take it personally that the place emptied out as we come to talk about street policy, but
What's
I know
the matter
it's
with these
important to the council. So the City Council should have a PowerPoint that was distributed last night through Holly. I also do have it on the screen, and that's what we'll present from today. And I also, so if people have that, we can start. And I want to start with really an overview of what we're here to talk about today. So our goal at the end of the day today is to actually propose a new program for financing and paying for street reconstruction in the city of St. Paul. This has been an issue that we have discussed at length for the past few years between the administration and the city council, always working to try and find a different way to finance the street reconstruction programs in the city. One thing I'll remind you of is that since the early 90s, we have been doing street reconstruction under the RSVP program. And one of the issues that has come up that we've been working on, or trying to work on between the council and the administration, is a way to come up with a program that's actually more affordable and more predictable for our residents as they get a street reconstruction. And I'm confident that what we'll present today actually will solve those two goals. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge and thank the other people that throughout the city that have helped work on this project. Again, so this was a culmination of work from the Office of Financial Services and Real Estate, from Public Works, Director Lantry and her staff, from council staff with Holly, and also with the city attorney's office, with input again from a couple different public hearing or a couple different policy sessions we've had with city council over the years, trying to get to the place that we're at with this proposal today.
And Mr. Hurley, you said this, but I'm going to say it again. So today we're talking about our street reconstruction financing. And a lot of times, I think because we have different names now this is, the moniker is St. Paul Streets. We get this confused with our street maintenance fund, which is formerly known as the right-of-way. We are not talking about the right-of-way today at all. We're talking about the street reconstruction project that was formerly known as RSVP. So, and we might have to remind ourselves that a few times, because I think because there are ways that they touch in terms of our street frontage, it gets a little complicated. So I may just kind of keep bringing us back to remember we're talking about the street reconstruction program as opposed to the right-of-way. Ms. Naker.
I would also like to propose new names. Frank, Bob, it doesn't matter, but they're too close together.
I'd
Bring it up.
prefer it wasn't Frank and Bob.
It doesn't have to be Frank and Bob.
So, thank you.
Council President Brenmo and Council Member Naker, any name that you can come up with that would help us differentiate these programs would be greatly appreciated. We're finance people, and we look at the numbers, and I appreciate the comments, Council President Brenmo, because it does get confusing talking about the street maintenance service program versus St. Paul Streets or street construction program.
But it goes
So-
beyond, I mean, it goes beyond the name of the programs. There are reasons why it gets complicated because we're talking about frontage and how we charge people. So I just think it's important to be clear what program we're talking about today.
Good. So I have an overview on the screen for the City Council, and I'm going to split this presentation between myself and our Chief Budget Analyst, Susan Earle, who will join me momentarily. But for the first 3 points, I'll take the lead on those. So I'll start by talking about what is the current program and how do we finance streets, just to give the council a reminder of what that is. I'll get in then to the key points of what the current assessment practices are. And then I don't want to say problems, but issues that the council and the administration have with the current financing sources and the actual practices that we have in place. And then I'll move it over, the presentation over to Susan, who can talk about the administration's proposed recommended changes to the financing source and to the policy around assessments. And then have Susan then get into the timeline, because as we've said, we've been working on this for the past couple of years. But we do need to get into the market and we do need to get into the street to start these construction projects so we can get them done, started this spring. So we'll talk about the timeline then. So with that, this slide, we talk about what is the current financing source for street reconstruction in the city of St. Paul. And what we use is street improvement bonds. It's important to understand that this has been the tool we've used since the early 90s when RSVP, the Residential Vitality Program, started. And the key point here is that in order to use this financing source, per state law, we as a city needed to assess 20% of the costs of the project to the property owners on the streets that were reconstructed. And again, the issue that comes up on that is back in the mid-90s and moving on, 20% was really construction costs were not escalating as they have been recently. And I could come back in front of the City Council and talk about what the projected rates would be. We could talk about whether we believe they were affordable or not. But really, the construction market has changed, and it's changed drastically since then. And one of the issues that we run into is 20% really has become unpredictable for us and unaffordable. So that is what the premise to the new proposal that the administration is going to bring to the council today. A couple key points that I will make on the current assessment practice. Again, so we're in the market. We have now sold bonds, and now we need to figure out how to assess property owners in order to collect money from them to help pay for the debt service of the bonds. And again, I talked about that was set at a minimum of 20% of the costs. A couple of the key points that are in the current policy that are not necessarily going to stay in the proposed changes are really listed here. A couple things that I'll highlight. First is what we called the 20-year rule, and what that meant is any residential property that got an RSVP project only on a corner, only on one side of their street, we couldn't come back and assess them for the other side within 20 years. And we'll address that in the new proposal. The second one is this is what we call the irregular shaped lots. And again, about 4,000 lots, or about 5,000 properties within the city of St. Paul, are what we call irregular. And what that means is that either their front footage is far greater or far less than the back footage of their lot. So you look at essentially a triangle-shaped property in which they may have 30 or 40 feet on the street and 150 feet in the back versus a property that has 100 or 150 feet on the front and then has 50 or something less in the back. And what our current policy is that we have a formula in real estate that what I would say normalizes these properties, so they're not benefiting or having a penalty for having these irregular shaped lots, and that is also part of what we will talk about in the new proposal. We talk about in the current policy that there is on residential properties on the corner that there is a short side subsidy. The new program will address a proposal on how to address or how to deal with residential properties on the corner. Our current practices also is that all of the properties are then assessed on their actual street footage on their properties. Rates today are set by project area. And then other points are the city, state, and Ramsey County do pay these assessments, and I know that there's been different ideas out there about who pays and who doesn't pay. I'm just to set the record straight. These people do pay. Who doesn't pay when we do street assessment program is federal buildings, the Met Council, and cemeteries. And those are for various, either they're in law that they don't pay, or the city council has made a decision that they won't pay.
What about railroads?
Railroads do pay. So the next slide talks about, it just goes to highlight the current situation for 2018 on if we were not to change this policy. And this really sets the cost at 20% of costs. And when you look at the three projects that we have, Woodlawn, Jefferson, Wheelock, and Como, you can see if we were not to change this policy, the rates that we would have to assess are in the column assessed 20% of costs. And the result is that that'd be 65% greater than last year. And when we're talking about whether that's affordable or whether that's predictable, in my opinion, it is neither. And this is where we have the opportunity now to try and work to change under the new policy, again, to try to get to predictable and more affordable. So as Susan will bring you through the new proposal, the results are in the far right column, in which instead of $198 on the Woodlawn project, we'd be looking at $130, or a $68 reduction versus what would have happened. And then again, on the Wheelock and the Como, which are arterial streets, our current policy would dictate that we would be looking at around $233 a foot for both of those. In the new program, what we would be assessing is $138, or $95 less than what that cost was. Again, in our opinion, obviously far more affordable than what would be under current policy.
And Mr. Hurley, that's a foot. And so I think when we look at those numbers, it's like, 233.
Per foot, right.
I pulled out the old calculator, and for a 50-foot lot, which I think between 40 and 50 are average city lots, is $11,650. So, it's, I know 233 is a lot, but when you look at it that way, and then on Wheelock Parkway, we had this conversation last year, it's an irregular street, it curves, and we had a church come and testify that had a 350-foot frontage. So it's meaningful in a lot of ways when you multiply it out by how many feet are the frontage, just for context.
Moving on, so a change in this policy, when you are actually going to charge less under the assessments, doesn't come for free. And one of the points that I needed to make in this next and final slide that I'll have is, what is the impact of changing the assessments? And I think this is really my attempt just to get information in front of the City Council of what it means really under three different scenarios. Should we continue under current practice, and I have 24% in here, is because on average for the past 10 years, the average assessment has been, it ranges between 20 and 25%, and really the average is 23.9%. So in the first column, you can see that if we were to continue as the current policy was, we really wouldn't have a change. Therefore, we wouldn't have a change in the levy to support the debt service on these bonds that pay for the street reconstruction. But if we are going to move to the proposed policy, what that results in for 2018 is about a 12.5% assessment rate of cost of the construction. But what that would mean is that you'd be actually shifting the revenues from assessments to property taxes. And so the cost of that in year one, or paid 2019, is about $88,000. Again, so $88,000 won't come from assessments to be used to pay debt service on these street bonds, but rather it would come from a property tax levy spread across the entire city. Again, $88,000 spread across the entire city really is pennies per household. But again, it's important to understand that as you start a new policy, you looked at $88,000 in year one. Actually, this is an annual program, so it will actually add up on top of itself with minor levy increases compared to the base. At the request of some council staff and some council members, I did include in the far right column should the city council want to understand what it would mean if you took the entire street reconstruction program and put it all on property taxes versus the proposal, which is this shift, a bit of a shift, less than 20%, you could see what would happen to the levy. Again, this is not a recommendation of the administration. We do have reasons behind that around the shift from having folks, the neighbors, the people last year and for the past 20 years paying for their street reconstruction in front of their house versus not paying moving forward. And also just getting to certain properties that just don't pay property taxes, and we would have no way to collect money from them if they actually got a street reconstruction program. So again, if there's any questions on that, I can take it. But then again, this is for display purposes for the council understanding the levy shift. So.
Okay, and I know Ms. Naker has a question. It's hard to conduct business at the moment. We'll try.
I'm also fine with waiting until we have a solution, but I don't know if one is forthcoming.
It seems like we've hit the crescendo. Okay, Ms. Naker.
Okay. So I guess I just wanted to dive in a little bit more into the levy increase question. So the increased levy for 2019, is that $185,000 total for the year, or is that per project?
Council President Brenmo and Councilmember Naker, the $185,000 for 2019 would be for the entire program, not for a specific project. Okay. It would be the debt service increase shifted to the levy based on selling the entirety of the bonds that we're proposing to sell.
So I guess what I keep struggling with this program in terms of and I am generally in favor of the move away from having the 20% assessment, because I think that it makes sense for a lot of the reasons that you've already detailed, and I know we're getting to the recommendation, but I'm just wondering, it seems to me like the greatest issue with this program being unpredictable isn't that the rates change so much from year to year and you don't know what the rate is going to be next year, because it's not like on your individual street you have the reconstruction this year and the next year the rate is totally different for you, right? You have it done once every 20 years or so on your street, or less frequently. I think what's unpredictable is when your street is going to be up for reconstruction. And most people don't have $11,000 that they're just kind of hanging on to for the moment when their street comes up for reconstruction. So I guess I'm just wondering if it's 20% that the property owners pay and 80% that everybody else in the city pays. For an individual property owner, the difference between that and just having the levy increase so that every year you're paying a little bit more but you're never hit with an $11,000 bill seems like it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I hear what you're saying about then we wouldn't be able to assess the non-tax-paying properties, although when we looked at that with right-of-way, we found out that those aren't actually a huge percentage of the properties as we thought. So can you talk a little bit more about why that 0% assessed and just going to the levy was not a good option?
And before you do, I just have a couple things that I think are worth putting in that mix. And one is that there is a schedule of projects. And so you might not know 20 years in advance when that project's going to happen, but speaking from my own experience, like we knew a project was coming. And when we start planning for a project, another one is currently underway. So we've been using sort of the basis of the project of 2015 to set the stage for what's going to happen in 2016. And in my project area, the rates doubled. We expected about maybe, I can't remember, I think we were saying it went from $75, and we thought maybe it'd be $85 or $90. So people were planning for $90, and then it actually came in at $140. And it was based on what the rates were in contract bids for projects like that in the area. So that's just a 2-year, but I think also then there was another area of my neighborhood that knew that they were next. So there's sort of the planning, and there was actually a 20-year plan that's been extended. And I think that's something that we've tried to reestablish a schedule for as well. Right. So I guess I'm saying I don't think that folks they do start saving.
Well, I guess I would just say I think you can know that that there's a way to know that the project is coming up, but
you mean that?
The average person doesn't know to go to our street reconstruction schedule and check for those things. And, certainly thinking about some of our folks, like we were just talking about with minimum wage, who aren't familiar with our processes or don't speak English as a first language. So I just think it's hard to know that. And then even if you do know 5 years in advance, to be able to save up, for that hit even 5 years from now is a big deal. So,
Council President Brennan, two things that I want to add to what you had mentioned, but I think will also help answer your question, Councilmember Naker, is with the new financing tool that we'll be proposing, and you'll hear this from Susan, one of the things that has to change in order to issue bonds under the new mechanism is the City Council actually has to adopt a 5-year street plan every year. So it'll be a rolling 5-year street plan, so people will know when their street construction projects are coming, which is different from what we have done previously under the RSVP Street Improvement Bond Program. Second is, again, and I mentioned this, is under the old program, we were by law required to assess a minimum of 20% of the costs. And so while we knew 20% was the number we had to meet, what we didn't know was what the construction costs were going to be. So we were at the will of the market for what the actual project was going to cost as far as inflationary costs, as far as the conditions of the street and what was underneath the streets as far as what that was going to cost. So we were basically waiting for the bids to come back, understanding that at least 20% had to be assessed. So the unpredictability was there and the unaffordability was there. What this new program is going to allow us to do is set the rates based on what we will use, and we'll talk about this. We will set rates with affordability and predictability as part of the decision-making points, along with what does the cost of the construction does. But I'm not tied. The city is not tied to a minimum 20% number anymore. It will be based on other factors, not a arbitrary 20% must. So,
Ms. Naker.
I appreciate that, but I don't think it's answering my question, because I support the move from the 20% minimum to what we're talking about now. And I understand the reasons for that in terms of affordability and predictability from our perspective. I'm just asking, again, even if we have a 5-year streets plan, most people aren't going to know what that means, where to find it. And I'm just wondering, given that the impact to the levy seems minuscule. In fact, I would imagine with our tax base growth, this, even if you increase the levy by this amount, people's actual taxes probably wouldn't go up at the rate that we're growing right now. So I'm just wondering why the 12.5% versus the 0% decision was made.
I guess, Council President Brennan, Council Member Naker, three things. First thing I would say is, again, I want to make sure people who don't pay property taxes pay for street reconstruction. Number two is, when I look at the property tax impact of going to zero, it may look like it's minuscule in year one, but it's not minuscule in year 2038 when you have now done 20 years of 12.5 or whatever we sell in bonds. This accumulates year after year because it is 20-year debt that we sell. And third, I think I lost my third point, but it really has to go to back to the point of people should have some expense to getting a new street in front of their house, and I don't know when you cut that off, because for the past 25 plus years, property owners have paid for a portion of the street reconstruction in front of their house. So
right, in this particular, we're looking right now at the continuation of the Grand Round last year from Como to Danforth, but essentially Dale Street. So if this year we said zero, then the people on Wheelock between Como and Dale paid $140 a linear foot for their project, and then in 2018 it's zero.
I mean, any change is going to mean it's going to be unfair for the people who paid more before. But.
How do you phase it in somehow?
Is there any other questions on the impact assessment? Okay. We can get Susan into the recommended changes in the policy.
Morning, council members. Susan Earle, Chief Budget Analyst in OFS. I'm going to walk you all through the recommended changes to the St. Paul Streets financing that Todd was talking about. First, our financing changes. We're going to be recommending that we go from street improvement bonds to street reconstruction bonds. The biggest change and really the biggest fix that comes along with that is that that doesn't require the 20% assessment. Those bonds do come with some other requirements. As Todd mentioned, a 5-year street plan needs to be approved by the City Council. There are also some limitations on the improvements that can be made. For example, they can't be used to add curbs and gutters. But there are exceptions to that, for example, like public safety concerns. We don't think that there's a lot of work that we can't fund with the street reconstruction bonds, but anything that wouldn't be funded under that financing source, we could fill in with CIB. So we don't think that that's going to be an issue.
One moment, Ms. Henningsen.
So if the council has to adopt a 5-year street plan, can it be amended from year to year?
Yeah.
There just needs to be a, okay.
So it would be every year. Our understanding is that every year, that it's sort of at the beginning of the process, you'd come back and you would be amending that project or amending that plan, and you'd be adopting that every year before you sell the bonds.
Mr. Hurley.
Council President Brenwell, one of the things that I kind of saw your look of complex when Susan mentioned using CAB. It is not using dollars within the CIB budget. It would be using authority to borrow under the CIB law. So it wouldn't be taking away from the CIB pot when we talk about that.
Yeah, and I think the other concern I had, and it sounds like you've thought through, but Councilmember Tolbert and I worked a few years ago to remove the opt-out option, and a lot of those opt-out options in my area in particular have no curbs and gutters. So if we're continuing, that would be kind of the double whammy for neighborhoods like that have in the past tried to opt out, so you can't opt out. Oh, and by the way, because you have a bad unimproved road to start out with, you have to pay 8 times more than other neighbors that have more finished, completed roads. So how do we navigate that?
You mean with the, Council President Brenwell, your question is on how we would navigate needing to add curbs and gutters?
Yeah, with these, I mean, the very unimproved roads shouldn't be, I mean, in some ways, they're the areas that most need these improvements. So I want to make sure that we're not moving forward with another barrier for our, the most challenged streets in our city.
Right. Councilmember Brennan, so we'll get into how we would be setting the rates if projects came through those areas that do need those improvements.
Okay.
But as I said, we talked about, we looked at the statute, and we do think that there are ways that these street reconstruction bonds can be used to add curbs and gutters. It's just sort of making sure that it fits into the other exemptions that are in state law. That's something that just came up a lot of, there are these restrictions, which folks may or may not be aware of, but looking at that in Public Works, looking at that, engineers thought that there would be ways that we could still fit projects that we need to under this authority. I just mentioned the CIB authority, and I appreciate Mr. Hurley's clarification as sort of a backstop that moving to this type of financing wouldn't eliminate projects from consideration to be done within St. Paul Streets.
Because of those additional changes.
Correct.
And I think for me, it's more a question of equity. We really don't want to discourage. I understand in the past why some neighborhoods were like, no, we don't. Our home value is only this much, and paying this additional charge really isn't going to change the value of my house, no matter how many times we said it would.
Sure.
And I think they're right. So I think as long as we have that understanding of that's a challenge we'll have to face, and that there is an equity component there, that's good. Ms. Naker.
Thank you. Can street reconstruction bonds be used for sidewalks?
Council President Brenmo, Councilmember Naker, my understanding is yes, that they can be used for sidewalks.
Thanks.
On slide 8, so these are the, in addition to the financing source changes that we would be recommending some changes to the assessment policies as well. The first would be that projects would be planned in space such that no property would be assessed more than once every 20 years. So this sort of replaces the 20-year rule under current policy that we would manage our projects such that no one would be assessed more than once in that 20-year period. For corner residential properties, there'd be they'd be treated somewhat differently. For situations where a corner has work done on one side of their property, regardless of the side, they would be charged based on their short side front footage. If both sides are done within a project, then they would get a 50% discount on both sides.
Which is similar to a right-of-way.
Correct.
Our street maintenance program. Yeah. Okay.
So then the next point around setting a policy on rates sort of gets to your question, Council President Brenmon, on equity, but we would be setting, since we wouldn't be tied to the 20% assessment rule, we'd be putting in a policy where we would assess rates every year, and that we could, the policy would require OFS and Public Works to consider a variety of factors when setting rates for projects year to year, and we would consider things like project costs, project-specific factors, inflation, special benefit, feasibility, affordability, other factors as necessary in order to set the rates every year, again, since we wouldn't be tied to that 20% as a minimum assessment. And then just to kind of round out and mirror what Mr. Hurley covered earlier, we wouldn't be making any changes to irregular shaped lots, corner commercial properties, and we'd continue to set rates by project.
Ms. Nicker.
Thank you. Council President Brenmon just mentioned this, but I do think there are similarities between the two programs, and certainly between street maintenance and street reconstruction, or St. Paul streets. And I think it seems that the logic that applies for corner and irregular lots for street reconstruction program should be similar to the street maintenance program. So I note that the corner properties are the same, but currently with our street maintenance program, we don't have any special calculation for irregularly shaped lots. And I'm wondering, I'm wondering why that is and why we're recommending keeping the calculation here, and whether it would be possible to make those two things consistent.
Council President Brenmon, Councilmember Naker, I think we could consider that. I think it just seems like this is, in some ways it is very similar, but in other ways it is sort of a different, these projects are much bigger, they come through every once in a while, so there's just some other considerations with how you would treat those lots, and that do lead to a little bit of a different consideration than St. Paul, or excuse me, than street maintenance service program.
And I don't, that is where I would say that is street maintenance. And if we want to talk about changing street maintenance structuring, then we should have that conversation too. And instead, and if you don't mind, stick with this reconstruction for this. And I think I know this is an issue that is important to you, but this is where I feel like once we start mixing these two conversations, it gets complicated.
I completely am fine with that. I just wasn't sure when we're planning to talk about that, and so I wasn't sure if it was appropriate for now. But if we have a plan to talk about it,
we could.
Okay.
So moving to slide 9, the intended outcomes, so the goals of these, and what we're hoping that these recommendations will be accomplishing is just to increase predictability, uniformity, and affordability in this program for residents as projects come through, and as St. Paul Streets projects are in their neighborhoods. Any other questions on the proposed recommendations?
Mr. Tolbert.
So overall, what would these changes mean for how many streets we'd get done every year?
Council President Brenmon, Councilmember Tolbert, this wouldn't change necessarily how many projects we can get done. It still assumes $12.5 million of project every year. That gets squeezed over time with inflation, but this proposal doesn't impact how much we would spend or how many projects we could do necessarily as part of what this is. Like naturally over time that can become an issue, but none of these recommendations impact the number of projects we could do.
It's just how you pay the debt service.
Sure, it's just how you pay the debt service on what those projects are. So.
And would this lock us into $12.5 million for the next 20 years, or could we increase that?
Council President Brenmon, Councilmember Tolbert, no, it wouldn't necessarily. Our numbers are run assuming $12.5 million a year, with the exception of 2018, which is already programmed at 15.5. But these changes wouldn't lock us into that number in the future. And
what would be our ability to increase that now, so that going forward we can get more projects done?
Council President Brenmon, Councilmember Tolbert, I might have to ask Mr. That's more of a debt capacity question.
So,
Mr. Hurley.
Council President Brenmon, Councilmember Tolbert. So, what this did, again, as Susan talked about, this just made the assumption that we were continuing with $12.5 million in borrowing to fund street reconstruction in the city. What would have to happen is we would need to recognize that this, again, is how you pay the debt service on those bonds. Again, these are general obligation bonds, so the full faith and credit of the city is pledged to these. This doesn't stop the mayor for proposing in a 2019 budget, in addition to the overall bonding of for streets. But what has to be recognized is that any addition to this, I mean, this change already increases the required levy to support debt service. So as you increase the amount of bonds you sell, you need to take into consideration the amount of the levy that the levy would need to be increased in order to add to bonding to this program. Again, the assessments and the property taxes pay debt service, the bonds pay for the construction. So it would be an analysis of whether or not we can afford to levy more dollars to pay debt service on street reconstruction programs is the answer. Should this, we had not, right now I don't think it makes any sense to increase 2018 because we don't have the capacity to do any more work for 2018, and the 3 programs that Public Works has ready to go right now, they're not going to be able to design any more streets for 2018, but I think it's a fair question, and I'll address it with the administration on whether or not we should be considering in Mayor Carter's 2019 proposal whether or not to increase the bonding for street reconstruction in St. Paul. So.
Mr. Tolbert.
Yeah, and I would add on that. I mean, I think we should factor in our calculations increasing that because, one, inflation is going to catch up to us in the amount of projects we're going to do, and 2, we're already really far behind, and, you know, many of us at this table were part of the change from RSVP to SRSVP because we realized arterial roads were not going to get done otherwise, which was just short-sighted by people who were planning it years ago. But there are still many roads out there that were supposed to be done 20 years ago under the original plan or 30 years ago under the original plan. On a completely personal basis, my road doesn't have curbs yet. So it's just one of many. And, you know, we had in the ash borer, we had structure removal on my block 2 years ago, and they're not going to add trees until the construction's done, and the construction year's away. And that makes sense. I think that policy makes sense because you don't want to add new trees and then tear them down in 4 years. But this just shows, especially with ash borer and everything going together, we got to get caught up. I know neighbors who have curbs that are complaining that they need new curbs, and I always remind them, some of us don't even have curbs to start with. Be happy with what you got. I'm kidding, but I think that this is something I think I've said consistently for 5 years is we need to add to this investment because it's slowing down and we still have a lot. I mean, how many projects are left on the original list, do you think, Kathy?
I think we are up until 2036.
To complete just the one-time through that started.
The old RSVP program.
That started in 1994. Yeah, so we have a long way to go. Anyways, that's my pitch to the administration and others and to my colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a point that's come up again and again in our conversations. I mean, it's not just the street reconstruction, it's our sidewalk fund. I mean, I don't know if it's short-sighted of the people who initially set up the plan as much as we needed to continue to grow it. And I suppose, like everything, when it comes time to make budget decisions, what we decide which things we prioritize and which things get put on the back burner, and we'll need to tackle these things in the years ahead of us because we are too far behind on street reconstruction. I mean, that also includes lighting. There are plenty of areas in the city. I mean, curbs and gutters are important and amazing, but when there's not adequate lighting on your street, then your street doesn't feel safe. A lot of those bent straw lights are like stuck in trees, at least now until the ash trees get cut down. So I really appreciate that, bringing up that point, because it is true. $12.5 million is getting us less and less and less, no matter how we do the assessment piece of it. So, Mr. Tolbert.
Well, and the pipes under it. I mean, I still have lead pipes that go to my house and run along the way because those pipes haven't been replaced. And when you do the road construction, you can replace all the lead pipes and water can get in there and do that. I mean, so it's just not, I mean, it's a lot of things that aren't getting done on those roads when they're there. And just to clarify, the short side, it wasn't the RSVP project. I think that was a good idea. It was having no plan to replace arterial roads, which are the most used roads in the city of St. Paul.
Very true.
It was mind-boggling when I found that out, that Hamlin Avenue and other roads like that, we didn't have a plan to replace them. Now we do, but I think it was short-sighted not to have any plan to replace arterial roads years ago.
Right, fair enough. Ms. Naker?
Thank you. I just, going back to the recommended changes, again, that third bullet point about, it's a set of policy that increases rates by a somewhat predictable amount each year. Are we going to have more detail about this when we before the policy is finalized? Because it just seems like I need more information about what that somewhat predictable means, because if the rates are changing each year, then it seems like that's the opposite of predictable. And so what do you have in mind by that? And then would we be having input on those rate changes each year? Would those just be kind of automatically happening? How does that work?
Council President Brenmo, Councilmember Naker, somewhat the discussion that we had, and I think what was discouraged by the city attorney's office and others, is having like an annual inflator. So not to just say we're going to set it and forget it, we're trying to get it that that's not what the policy is going to be, that we're going to take into account a lot of different things and aim for predictability, but knowing that there's a lot of changes and a lot of different things that happen between from year to year over different projects and the specifics of each project, the specifics of the neighborhood. So that's what that is trying to get at, that it won't be something that we just set and say that's on autopilot and we'll bring you an X percent every year. In terms of input, I guess I'm not sure what the process would be going forward. I would assume it would continue to be like a collaborative discussion, but in the end, you know, the plan and the ability to sell bonds will come before you every year, as will like the final rates to be approved, and we can get into that with the timeline. So there will be opportunities for council input. You know, both those that are required, and then also discussions as we move forward in how these rates get set.
Right, and when we engage community members a full year or more in advance of a project taking place, and with this, under this plan, we'll know the rate when we initially go out to talk to the neighbors. Currently, we initially go out to the neighbors and say, it might be this much, we don't know. And then we go through a planning process and put it out for bid, and then we get another number. And sometimes that number changes again. So I think that the predictability is, it's not into eternity, but it's definitely a long enough time where people are engaged with a number that's an actual number from the beginning of the time they're notified about the project till the end. So there is that advantage. Are there other thoughts? So, I wanted to pause and say that I appreciate your work on this very much. Todd, I appreciate your work on this very much. Holly, you know more about street rates than you probably ever thought you would know about. I also want to thank former Council President Lantry, who this is something that we brawled about with, you know, kind of wrestling with how to move forward with this, and Mr. Stark as well, and all of the colleagues at the table. I mean, I know, like maybe one click after plowing the streets, street reconstruction is the thing that we get really engaged with when it happens in our community, because to Ms. Naker's point, nobody is expecting a $5,821 bill to come to them to do a street project, and we end up talking about financing. I think together we've worked to reduce the cost of financing these charges over 20 years, and we've really kind of chipped away and made this a process that works better for folks over time. So I just want to acknowledge that. You know, a lot of times we hear people say, I wasn't heard, I never was heard, and I really think that because of the feedback we get from the people that are on the receiving end of these bills, we have continued to change, adapt, and modify and make this a better program. And I think that the one thing we could do to make it even better is to speed it up and get these projects done so that Chris can get some curbs and we can get it.
It's not just me. There's a lot of streets.
Where there's no curbs, you just see the dirt. There's some over by Como Lake, and you just see the dirt pouring into the, you know, into the lake itself. So I think that that's great. But I guess the flip side of that is we've been talking about it for a long time, and this proposal is going to be in front of us next week, couple weeks.
Council President Brenmone, on slide 10, this lays out the timeline. March 14th is when the preliminary order for rates would be in front of the council, and when we would be setting the public hearing date for April for final order and to finalize the rates and to approve selling street reconstruction bonds and the 5-year street reconstruction plan.
So the policy change would be on the 7th then, or the 28th? Because I understand that that policy would have to change before you set the rates.
Council President Brenmone, I don't know if there's an official council action related to the policy specifically, or if it's just sort of the culmination is that we have the ability to sell the street reconstruction bonds and that the 5-year plan gets approved. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
I think you are.
Okay.
So there won't be a resolution coming before us. I would like to say that a lot of times we've had these conversations. I believe this is going to move forward, but we've had these conversations, and then when we move forward and some of the conversations I thought we had finalized at the council aren't included in our policy, then we hear back, oh, well, that was just a conversation. We didn't ever set a policy about that. So I think it's important to formalize this instead of have it be something that we agreed to here today at this meeting. Like, we need to know that this is what we're doing.
Councilman,
Ms. Naker.
I just want to thank you, second that, and I think it also leads to some confusion when I know that the council does not set administrative policy except by administrative ordinance. But I do think a resolution helps clarify what we did talk about and makes there be a decision point. Otherwise, people do leave these conversations. Nothing that we talked about today has any force whatsoever except influencing your decisions. Neither does a resolution, but at least a resolution helps concretize what we're all talking about. So I think it just helps being able to point to people and say, this is what we all agreed to.
So if it's a resolution that codifies this conversation and the recommendation, that would be the preference of the council.
Council President Brenmone, Councilmember Naker, we can certainly do that and bring something back. I think the 14th would be a good day to bring that forward along with the preliminary actions.
Okay, and I think it's just a good practice. There's just been conversations about how much we assess for sidewalks and other, the fees and financing, and it just, when it's not formalized, it doesn't really, it's like a ghost. Sure. Yeah. Okay, great.
Great.
Are there other questions before we adjourn this policy session? Great, big progress here today. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
everybody, for your work on this, and seeing nothing else, we're adjourned.